We're not out there fighting anything other than crime.
We see stuff that nobody should have to see.
Put your hands back! Hands it back! Hands it back! Go!
Get out of it, Mil. Get out of it! Get out of it!
Don't move! Don't move!
George 31, erect down.
Don't go! Don't go! Don't go!
Put it in paper. You're going to jail. Where else do you think you're going?
You're listening to The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. One of the missions I had when I started The Beat was not only to include the perspective of police officers from around the country, but federal agents too. It's a unique aspect to law enforcement because there's so many different agencies that you can pick from. And tonight we've picked from the FBI. On that note, we welcome you to episode 283 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is Volume 8 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. If you haven't checked out the previous episode 282, Volume 37 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit with Jim McVeigh. Now, Jim did 11 of his 20 years in the NYPD with ESU, and then the last 6 with the Aviation Unit. He's an expert pilot, still flies in the private sector, but did that from 1995 until his retirement in March of 2001. We'll get to my next guest, who's very interesting in his own right momentarily, but just first, a couple sponsors to run through. The first one is a company, well, that I'm familiar with because I own it, and that's MC Media Editing Services. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Of course, always available to help, like I've said before, and I hope you don't find yourself in a position where you're ever going to have to need an attorney. But if you do ever find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to need one, go with none other than Joe Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Good man, Joe. Shout out to retired NYPD Arson Explosion Squad Detective Bill Ryan and Darren Phillips in the live chat, and everybody else we got tuning in via LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. All right. My next guest was originally a police officer and later detective squad supervisor in Massachusetts before a pivot to the federal side of law enforcement brought him to the FBI. With 14 years on the job locally, it'd be 1997 when he decided to join the Bureau and go to the federal side, as I mentioned earlier. He served at the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, and his federal chapter would last 22 years until his retirement in 2019. And that, for this volume 8 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide, is retired FBI Special Agent Tom OConnor. Tom, welcome. How are you?
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you reaching out and having me on your podcast. It's looks like I've watched a bunch of them, and you're doing a great job getting the word out, and that's the key. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for making the time. And like I said before, the good thing about The Beat is you can get the federal side too, in addition to the local perspective. And your career is unique because you had both the local, as we'll talk about tonight, and federal perspective. Before we get into that, I believe you're a Massachusetts guy. Where'd you grow up?
Western Massachusetts, town called Northampton, Massachusetts. It's in the western part of the state, out near Springfield, Mass.
Okay. And did you have any family in law enforcement that influenced your path in civil service? Was it television shows that made you want to do the job?
I'll tell you what, it literally was exactly that. It was Adam 12, which was the rage back in the early 70s, that kind of thing. And Adam 12, Reed and Malloy were the thing that I went with. And I literally wrote in my childhood home, I wrote on the wall in crayon, my name is Tom OConnor. I'm in the 6th grade and I want to be a police officer. And that was, I set my goal at that point and went with it. And, never really changed my mind to do anything differently. So it worked out okay.
I would say so. Across 36 years doing both law enforcement, mass, and the FBI, as we'll talk about later. And for those of you in the chat, if you have a question, submit it, and I'll make sure to get to it at the appropriate time. Just a little heads up to you guys. So you originally started as a college police officer, which is very important now. It's always been important, but it's especially important now under the microscope in the light of all these recent shootings that we've seen across different places. You want to be secure anywhere, but especially in school. And you worked at Amherst College originally as a college police officer. Now, tell me about patrolling the college beat, because college students, as we know, can be quite the animals, especially when there's alcohol involved.
Yeah, and there usually is. So I started with the Amherst, Massachusetts Police Department, the town of Amherst, which is where Amherst College is, UMass is, the zoo, Hampshire College. It's right near what's called the five colleges. Has Mount Holyoke, Smith College, UMass, Hampshire College, and another one thrown in there. And so that area is just full of college students, and it's a great area. It really was a great place to be a police officer, something different every single day. You really could make a difference in a town that size, because you got to know people very well. And even though it was a college community, you even got to know a lot of the college kids during their period of time they were there. And some really good kids. And like I said, when you throw alcohol into the mix, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights were pretty amazing. I started when I was 18 years old, so I was actually underage enforcing alcohol laws in a college town. So it made for an interesting, evening shifts, and it was all night shifts, right? It was a lot of fun and a great place. Made some of the best law enforcement friends that I stayed close with from the Amherst Police Department that many years later.
And it's funny because there's so many different towns that operate that way, where you're starting your career as a law enforcement officer and enforcing the law and carrying a gun before you can even legally drink. So it creates quite the juxtaposition, if you will. But you always have somebody that's there to guide you and serve as something of a father figure or mother figure when you're starting out in a career like that salty veteran. So for you in Amherst, who was that salty veteran or veterans that you would say really shaped you early on?
Yeah, so there were many of them, but the ones that stand out in my mind, Jeff Roy was my first training officer when I actually made it to a cruiser, and out on the street in a car. Jeff was my training officer, and in those days it was well before the academy. So this was 1983, 84, and I didn't go to the state academy until 85. So your training and your training officer were so important. And once they cut you loose, you're out on the street by yourself. And I'll tell you, guys like Mike Sullivan, who was a patrolman there, Timmy Sullivan was a detective, just so many of them from the Amherst Police Department that really built that kind of bedrock of where you went in your law enforcement career. And I can tell you that the first night I got cut loose in a cruiser by myself, I was out, this is the big deal. And I'm driving down the road, there's a car swerving. I pull it over and walk up. Just, at that time we had the old 6-inch Smith & Wesson 357s. And I walk up to the car and ask for a driver's license. Almost got knocked over by the smell of alcohol, and the driver out of the car, and I noticed he's got blood all over him. This is my first car stop by myself. And as I'm giving this guy some sobriety tests, another person gets out of the passenger side of the car with a knife in his hand. And so I drop the driver to the ground, draw my 357 on this other guy. He quickly drops the knife, because actually he didn't even realize he had it in his hand. These two knuckleheads were taking a knife and stabbing it between their fingers. So their hands were completely covered with blood, and they were obviously drunk. And I'll tell you what happened there. As I was wrestling around with this first person, the cars were going by me. Nobody was stopping to help me. And then a car stopped. A person came up, helped me get the handcuffs on the first one and the second one, and then started heading back for his car, as you could hear the other cruisers coming. And that was an off-duty officer from the state police who stopped to help me, the only person who stopped to help me. And so those life lessons, very, very young, probably maybe 20 years old when this happened, taught me many things. But one of the most important things was your brother and sister law enforcement officers on or off duty are going to be there for you when you need them. And also, if you're going to be good at something in law enforcement, it's defensive tactics and your patrol tactics and that type of stuff for the street officer. So become as good as you can. And I went on and taught at the academy defensive tactics and patrol procedures. And mainly because of that incident, the first car stop changed my trajectory of my career and made me really start thinking seriously about how important it was to stay safe out there.
We're talking with Special Agent Tom OConnor, retired out of the FBI after 22 years. Previously, before that, a police officer and sergeant in Massachusetts. This is Volume 8 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Now, and listen, people say sometimes when a police officer rolls up on me at a traffic stop, why does he or she look so defensive? Why do they look so angry? It's not that they're angry. It's not that they're defensive and necessarily that they have it against you in a personal sense. You know you're a good citizen. They don't know that. And unfortunately, how many police officers have been in that situation, and you know this all too well, that have gotten seriously hurt or have gotten killed? You can't mess around in those traffic stops. The most dangerous things you can do, or one of them.
No, you can't. And, all officers know that it's one of the most dangerous points of your day is when you pull somebody over. In smaller communities, those officers are out there by themselves doing it. And just the past couple of days in Springfield, Massachusetts, they recognized the unfortunate anniversary of 2 officers, Beauregard and Scavina, who were killed in a single car stop where a person named Ortiz shot both of them. And those 2 young officers were in college at the same time I was going to the same college. So we actually knew these officers. And it really, it's another one of those things. I can remember walking out of the police station after hearing about the shootings. And, again, that's probably 1985. So very, very early in my career. And walking up the street, I was walking a beat at the time in the next city I ended up in, and really kind of thinking this again is a serious business. And everybody who puts on a uniform and a badge knows it's not just talk, that any time, any night, something could go wrong. And you may have to take a life or you have a life taken. And unfortunately, we've seen that happen much too many times across the United States in the history of our law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well said. Now, that next city that you walked the beat in, just to segue into that, was Northampton, and you transferred there in 1985. You're having a lot of fun in Amherst, and you're learning the job well. Why the transfer?
Well, it was, Northampton was a civil service town. It was a larger community, and although it was still a college town, it wasn't as much of a college town as Amherst. And so I learned kind of early on that every year that 18-year-old fighting male is going to regenerate with the next class, right? So as I would age, they wouldn't. It was really that the opportunity came up to go to Northampton. That was where I was born and raised. It was my hometown, and I wanted to go back there. I had actually started in Northampton as a police explorer in junior high school, so I knew a lot of the police officers there. I had great interaction with the police department. It's a really good department. And so I made the move to the city of Northampton in 1985.
So here you are with a little bit more experience underneath your belt, but how you policed in Amherst is dramatically different than how you're going to police in Northampton. It's the same people, same makeup, same demographics, that area of Massachusetts, but still laws might be different from town to town. And, even the way you talk to people might be different from town to town. So tell me about that process of having to relearn certain aspects where the core mission of the job is the same, but the area is slightly different.
Well, I mean, one of the things that was different for me going back over to Northampton was I really knew this community, right? I knew a lot of the families. City about 40,000 people. So I went to high school there. I lived there my entire life, and so it was a place that I really knew. And when you go out and you respond to a call for a burglary, it's somebody's parents that you may have gone to high school with. So you're helping in your hometown, that you know these people, and it made a big difference for me. Also, Northampton at the time had a little bit more of it's a larger community, so it had a larger crime issue that was being worked. So it was a move for me. A lot of it had to do with going back to my roots of the city where I was born and raised. And I can remember when I was a police explorer, so like maybe 15 years old, there was an officer who's still on the job. He retired as a sergeant, went back as a part-time officer, and he took me up to the Florence Diner, like this old New England diner, for a coffee, right, or a hot chocolate at that point. And we were sitting in. I thought it was great. Andy Trushaw, this great cop, brings me up to the Florence Diner for a hot chocolate. And we're sitting there, and the radio goes off. And now remember, I'm 15 years old, and he's just bringing me home in the cruiser. And there's a stolen van that just got reported coming through the part of the city we were in. Andy says, "Come on, let's go." We jumped in the car, and sure as anything, there goes the van by us. And so at 15 years old, I'm in my first high-speed pursuit, which you really couldn't get away with nowadays. You'd be out bringing a kid on that. But I'll tell you what it did for me. It cemented my career path. Just, there's so many things that happened in my life that said being a police officer was what I really wanted to do. And you asked for people who influenced your life. Guys like Andy Trushaw were there. When I became a detective, guys like Rusty Luce, Kenny Patnode. Just great role models, great people to work with. And, it became, the choice was right. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad I made every choice in my law enforcement career. I'm going to say that it was a positive step.
I'll say, yeah, definitely an upward trajectory all the way through. Now, before I get to you making detective and later on detective sergeant, tell me about some of the best arrests that you were able to make from your time on the beat in Northampton.
I'll tell you what, I was thinking about this, knowing I was going to be coming on here, and I think, some of the stuff that were just fun cases and cases where you influenced people that you knew, whether it be somebody as simple as somebody whose kid got caught up in the drug world, and you were able to help them get that kid into a program of some type, and whether that could be by arresting them and putting that kid into a court-ordered program of some type. That was always something that was very important to me. I lost one of my best friends growing up. One of my best friends as a kid died from a drug overdose, and it really cemented, again, all these things that happen in your life. Kind of say, this is why I'm doing this. And so I think when you talk about cases as a patrol officer, I really enjoyed patrol drug work. So car stops and finding drugs in cars, that type of stuff. And I was fairly successful with it. And that is one of the things that led to going to the Detective Bureau. But patrol is the backbone of law enforcement, and
Absolutely.
Being part of that community. And if you join a police department and your goal is to be the chief, then you're in the wrong job. Your goal should be to be the best patrol officer you could possibly be, and get out there, know the community, learn the community, work with the community, and those really good people in the community, which are the majority of them, are going to give you information to lead you towards the bad actors. And because they don't want them in their community any more than you do. And that is one of the lessons I learned as a patrol officer, was be visible. One of my role models in policing, my brother Jack was a police officer, started around the same time I did. He's 2 years older than me, and he went to Richmond, Virginia. At the time in the 90s, was a very violent city, and he was one of the best drug officers, patrol, task force guys that I've ever heard of. Just unbelievable amount of guns and drugs he was taking off the street. And one of the things he did, and it influenced me and sent me on that path, was he shaved his head long before anybody else was shaving their head. And the reason he did it, I went down and rode with him, went to a street survival school in Richmond, and he had shaved his head, and people recognized him, people knew who he was, and people went to him because he was the guy with the shaved head. And so at the time I was beginning to become follically challenged, and I said, it's gone, right? So I might as well use this for a benefit. And following my brother's footsteps, I shaved my head. And I'll tell you what, at the time, nobody else was doing it. And people would say, hey, go, they call the police station and ask for Officer Baldy, whether it be in Richmond or Northampton. And it got us a good community access, I guess. But yeah, I think patrol on the police department was such a great, enjoyable time, because you're out there. You have a front row seat to the circus. You do not know what is going to happen when you go out to work. I remember you were asking about kind of interesting things. I remember we were doing some community work. Community policing was big in the 80s and 90s. Called it community policing. They've changed the name, but it's pretty much the same thing. But around Christmas time, we were out in one of the projects doing delivering Christmas presents to kids that may not be getting any presents. And I was Santa Claus. I had a big, the fake beard and the whole 9 yards. And right. I went up to one of the doors, knocked on the door, and this guy answers the door, and he's like, "Hey, Santa Claus is here." And I knew I had a warrant for him for armed robbery.
Oh, goodness.
So I kind of pulled the beard down a little bit, and he's like, "Oh, no," right? And I said, "Here's the deal. We're going to go in, we're going to deliver the presents, and then you're going to drive away with Santa Claus, and you're not going to be in handcuffs. But if you run, this is not going to be good for anybody." And he's like, "Nope, I'm with you." We delivered the presents. The kids were happy. He got into the cruiser with Santa Claus. It looked like he was driving away in his sleigh, and everything worked out well. The kids didn't see their dad going down in handcuffs, and so I mean, working with a community like that, I think, is just so important. And if you don't get why that's important, then you should probably pick a different career path, I think.
No, of course. You know what? And to his credit, even though, listen, he's a robber still, at least he was, in that sense, he was a gentleman about it. He didn't give you a hard time. He understood the situation. He acted accordingly, to his credit.
Not all bad guys are bad guys.
Right. That's a good point.
People do things for a lot of reasons, and sometimes it just goes south for them. And, getting people in, like I said before, getting people the help, maybe it is through an arrest, or maybe it's through other means. But, if you're working, try and work with your community, then I think you're going to be doing good for it. I mean, those kids weren't going to be getting any great parenting from this guy, right? So to get him straightened out is only going to help those kids. And you see it, go the opposite way too many times. So.
No, that's true. Absolutely. We hear about the domino effect, and usually the domino effect carries a negative connotation to it. But there's times when it's the opposite. Like you said, it's a positive effect where that guy realizes, you know what? For the sake of my family, let me straighten up my act, man. And they straighten up their act. And you know what? As a result, the kids are spared a bad childhood. They go on to be productive citizens. He goes on to be a productive citizen in his own way.
It really is, like you said, a domino effect, or that ripple effect. That one incident can just go out and either screw up so many lives, or that can do the opposite, actually help many lives. So it's very important just to know that you're out there helping people and trying to get things done. But that was one of the stranger cases. Now, other times dressed as Santa Claus, we end up having to chase somebody down. I mean, it's people didn't realize that Santa Claus was a cop, I guess.
Yeah, no, listen, you can't, as we were talking about off the air, you can't make any of this stuff up. It's definitely impact policing with the capital I. Now, I wanted to get to your transition, of course, of being an investigator, because Listen, there's certain aspects of patrol that do require investigation. You roll up on a scene, especially if it's something like a domestic. Okay, what happened? What did you see? What did he look like? So on and so forth. But investigating it, of course, in policing on a detective's level or a sergeant in a detective squad's level is significantly deeper because there's longer term investigations. And you have to shift your mindset as a cop. Tell me about shifting from patrol's mindset to an investigative mindset.
Now, again, it's one of these things where you have that watershed moment where it's like a light bulb goes off, right? As I said, I was a pretty aggressive patrolman. I wrote a lot of tickets in my early days, and arrested a lot of people for drunk driving and possession of narcotics and that kind of stuff, and didn't give a whole lot of breaks in my earlier days because that was it, right? Going out there. And I was chosen to be a detective, and it was like a small detective bureau, about 5 guys really working the day shift, and then some evening guys. And Rusty Luce was one of the senior guys on the detective bureau, and he kind of pulled me aside early on and said, "Hey, you did great as a patrolman, but here's the deal: you have to learn to give people breaks." And I was like, well, what do you mean? We're investigating stuff. He goes, no one is going to talk to you unless you work with them in that manner, right? So his whole thing was not everybody's a bad guy, right? And so if you give people a break, maybe they're going to tell you something about something else that's going on that's more important than what this guy did. And it took a little while to kind of break that. Just the facts and writing everything down and booking everybody, to sitting back and sitting down, have a coffee with somebody and talking to them, and maybe not putting the bracelets on them, but giving them some slack and see if they come back with something. Because really, that's what a detective does. It's working with the community again, but working informants, working people telling you stuff that they may not normally tell you, but you build that rapport with many times criminal element for them to give you information to forward your cases. Because really the best cases take place when you have good human sources telling you what's going on. Even in this day and age of all the electronics and social media and all this stuff that you can get great evidence from. But I still strongly believe that the human sources, the human beings talking to you, giving you that piece of that pie that's going to lead you somewhere, is still the most important stuff. And you can corroborate it with telephonic, electronic, all sorts of different evidence and media type recovery. But the key to that is you need to be able to talk to people in a detective role in a different format than you do when you're a patrolman. I mean, when I write a ticket, write a ticket to somebody, I'd hand them a $150 ticket and say, have a good day. I meant it. I meant have a good day. Like, I hope this doesn't happen. Their day gets better from here. But doesn't that sound pretty damn sarcastic?
It does.
To hand them a ticket and say, have a good day, right? I didn't get it. When I went to the detective bureau and worked with Rusty Luce, I said Kenny Patnode, Bobby Dunn, all these guys that had done it for a bunch of years, and I learned that talking to people is the only way to get the detective or agent's job done. If you don't have the ability to sit down and really talk to somebody for a long period of time, then you're probably not going to be aces at detective work, because that's what it's all about, is getting people to trust you and to give you information so that you can get the real bad guy in the box and then do an interrogation with that person. And that also includes building rapport and getting that person to trust you and tell you things that are not in their best interest. And that's a skill in and of itself. And I think it takes years, and working with people like the guys that I did in the detective bureau, and that just sets you up for so many good cases down the road that you wouldn't get if you were just knocking on doors, taking a name, and walking away. You gotta sit down and and talk to people. That really is the key. If there's anything I could tell young officers or people thinking about getting into law enforcement, is hone your skills to be able to talk to people, because if you can do that, you're gonna excel. You'll do fine, and you'll have more fun too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, collaboration is an essential part of policing. They go hand in hand in every respect, no matter what rank you hold. But if you're in a detective bureau, it's especially key because it's more deliberate. It's more methodical. Like we were talking about earlier, you have to take your time. And the bad guys, or even people that may know the bad guys, they know what you want. They know what you're after. But if you could break it down on a human level and have that heart to heart and find things in common, rather it be sports, food, just humanize them or make them feel human in that moment. You're right. It does go a long way. And they're going to, if they don't remember anything that you said, they at least remember how you treated them.
Yeah. And there are people who have done some heinous crimes that, I wouldn't sit down and drink a coffee or break bread with them on a social level. Right. And hopefully none of us would. But literally for your job, you have to be able to sit down with somebody who is a child molester, somebody who committed a homicide, and get them to believe that you, in some way, respect them, build that rapport so that they trust you. It isn't always easy. That's for sure. But you're not going to get that confession. You're not going to get good information that's going to lead you to additional evidence unless you take your time. And 100% patrol officer rolled up to a call. You got to take care of business quickly because you got to get to the next call, right? And detectives and agents in federal organizations, you have that luxury of knowing who you're talking to. And it's like we talked earlier before the show about how I was impressed that you had done your homework on who you're going to be interviewing. It's exactly the same thing. If you walk in cold and say, "Hey, did you kill so-and-so?" No.
I want a lawyer.
Where's that conversation go? It doesn't go
Nowhere.
anywhere. But if you start with, a good length of time of just talking, and then work that in there a little bit more casually, and know some stuff about this person, so that they know you're taking an interest in them, and maybe not positively, but and that can also be a positive. If they know a lot of things about them, they may think you know more than you actually know. We used to call it keep the myth alive, right? We know everything. Right? Oh, that's a great line. We know everything. No, really, we don't know everything, but we want you to think we know everything. Then you're like, what do I got nothing but to tell them, right? So, it's a skill, and there's, when you get into law enforcement, there's great schools of read techniques, read schools, and the FBI has their own schools that I went to as a police officer, and take a little bit of each one of those, and then put your own personality into it, and come up with your techniques, how you do it. But proper planning, right? It prevents bad performance.
Oh, it's true. It definitely goes a long way. Now, last note on your local career before I get to your 1997 transition into the Bureau. Like I mentioned, detective squad supervisor, and you were specifically supervising the Gangs and Violent Crimes Task Force. A lot of it also had to do with narcotics. And narcotics and gangs, as I told a previous guest, they go hand in hand. If gangs aren't running drugs, they're running guns, or they're running prostitution rackets. It's one of those three. It seems to be the big three with them, and the mafia too. So when it comes to something like that, where you're talking about dealing with heinous people, heinous with the capital H, what are some investigations from that time frame that stick out where you found yourself saying afterwards, A, we did great work, and B, man, am I glad we put those people away?
Well, I tell you what, there are in Western Massachusetts in the 1990 up through 95 and 96 when I started transitioning out, we were really just starting to see gangs showing up, and actually people were kind of hesitant to say that there were gangs in the area, and but those of us working on the street realized, yes, there clearly are. These young gangsters are wearing Latin King T-shirts. They're wearing the beads. They're telling you who they are, and they're running guns. They're running at the time. Crack was the big drug of choice and a big money maker, right? So cases related to the narcotics and gang hand in hand. I mean, 'cause that is just people say that drugs are a non-violent crime. I'm here to tell you that the majority of your street crime has something to do with either somebody trying to get money for drugs or somebody selling it or selling it on somebody else's territory. It all plays into the same mix, right? So I think trying to get ahead of that. One of the cases that I remember early on in the drug gang type stuff was it was actually a college kid who was selling heroin and had a very good informant. And one of my best friends, Steve Garn, was a state police officer. We had actually started in Amherst together, and then in 1990 or so, he went to the state police and I went to the city police, and we kind of met back up again on the drug task force. It was a Mass State Police drug task force, and I was assigned to that for about 7 years. And Steve was an amazing undercover, as were a number of other troopers that worked out of that office, out of the DA's office. And we put a case together with an informant that we had who bought some heroin from this guy, and we hit it. And we took about 100 bags of heroin from this college kid, and it was one of the things that we had started seeing some overdoses in town and in the surrounding communities, and so hitting this one dealer was a big deal, right? Because it literally took off a good portion of that heroin from the street. The problem was that just backfills, right? And the next people coming up were just kind of filled in a little bit different type of mentality, a little bit more violence that went along with it. There is a couple of cities around the Western Mass area that have a much larger drug and gang problem than the Northampton, Amherst, Greenfield areas. But they're influenced. Those cities are influenced by those larger cities that are there. And we always used to say that if you're a guy selling hardware, hammer salesman, whoever, and there's a place where there are a bunch of carpenters and nobody's got hammers, that's where you go, right? So that's what they're doing, was coming across the town border, the city border, and doing the drug trade. And Steve and I developed an informant who was unbelievable. He could call up anybody and get him to deliver drugs. In Massachusetts, if you have more than half an ounce of cocaine, it's a very serious 5-year felony. And we literally call up a dealer, have him bring it to a parking lot, and take that person off for half an ounce of coke, and they get a serious charge. And we did it on a regular basis. The idea was to make people think twice about coming into this city, because there's so many people getting picked off for bringing the drugs over to our community in a controlled environment, that they would think twice about it. And there was some evidence that it was working, and it clearly worked with the gang element, where the gangs kind of settled in communities around the city that I was working in, Northampton. And because we were very aggressive, and I don't know that you could be as aggressive now. You pull over a car for a taillight out, and you end up leaving there with 5 Latin King T-shirts and all their beads. And these kids gave them to you because they don't want anything to do with you, right? So, and in my office with all these Latin King stuff, the Familia, Solitos, all this stuff was hanging in my office. So when I brought somebody in to interview in my office, they saw all this gang stuff on the walls, and they realized, these guys aren't playing around with the gangs. And so it was a way of kind of putting a buffer around our community. in this day and age, I don't know if that would be possible to do as easily because that type of aggressive law enforcement, we might be looked down upon. But I'll tell you the truth, it kept the gang element out of that area for a good period of time, and I think there's being lawfully aggressive in your enforcement of laws that are on the books to try and let these gangsters know that you're not putting up with it. And so if you can't get away with the little crimes, you're less likely to try the larger crimes in that community. And I think that kind of worked for us. And so that was the type of stuff we were working. It was much more street level type enforcement for that type of stuff. Now, some of the drug cases, even on a local scale, went large, right? So on that drug task force, Steve, myself, Timothy C. Carr, a whole bunch of great investigators. A kid that I actually went to high school with was selling pot. And now nobody cares, right? But he was selling like pounds of pot, and that was way above his pay grade, clearly way above his pay grade. So when we did a search warrant on his house, and I said to him, I said, hey, where are you getting all this stuff? This is clearly not you bringing this stuff in. He doesn't have a network, doesn't have anything. It's kind of like a lug that shouldn't have this level of dope. And he said, I know where there's like a couple tons of this stuff. And so I think it was Timmy that said a couple tons, like you say she weighs a ton, or like that kind of ton, or like over 2,000 pounds, and it ended up being well over 2,000 pounds of processed marijuana that was brought in from the islands, brought to actually Maryland, offloaded and driven in a food truck, like a dry corns bread type truck, up to New Hampshire, and driven into the woods, and they dealt all their dope through New England, based out of there. And we hit the place up there with New Hampshire State Police, Mass State Police, and I was the local guy coming along with them because it started in our community, and got a couple of tons of processed marijuana. So it was like $9 million at the time. So those little cases where somebody's doing something led to larger cases down the road. And again, it comes back to talking to people. He wasn't going to tell us that if he didn't trust us.
That's true.
And so that's the type of drug work we did. I was very proud of it because it was making a difference for our community, right? And taking the heroin, the cocaine off the streets, and made it more difficult for people to get in, and putting some dealers in jail for a good period of time. So I was proud of working those cases. It was something I knew was making a difference in our community.
Yeah, and when people look at marijuana, they think, oh, to your point, they may think it's harmless. They may think of Cheech and Chong, right? Because it's comedic, or Harold and Kumar, but it's not. Usually, tied to these sales of marijuana, even if the drug may not be as lethal, it's not lethal. You can't OD on it like you can on cocaine or heroin or other drugs, fentanyl. It's tied to someone who's lethal, because that person's usually carrying a gun. That person usually probably has a couple of attempted murders, if not murders, on them. So the people, even if the drug itself may not be lethal, like I said, those who are trading it are lethal. So you can get a lot of violent people off the street that way.
Yeah, and also those drug sales are funding the other criminal elements that are taking place within your city. And so you can't have the criminal element making thousands and thousands of dollars and think that they're going to be going out and doing good things with it. That's not going to happen. So
no, not at all.
You have to take it at all levels and work that. We could go on for days about the legalization of marijuana. I'm now the old guy. So
no, I don't. I see people that partake in it. I'm just like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Hey, man. And their eyes are bloodshot red. It's like, get it together, will you? Please. For the love of all that is good.
My theory is, nobody ever started shooting heroin, right?
Mm-hmm. You work
they
your way up.
drinking beers, and then some went to the next step, and it's a different time than it was in the 90s, but we still have the same problems, right? We have, and I think we should concentrate on, as I've been saying over and over here, the community, getting people help, getting them away from the drugs, and not making everything as available as we possibly can. There are communities where they're talking about making just about everything legal, and then good luck to your people walking downtown trying to enjoy a good dinner and bring money into the community, because they're not going to be showing up there. So
yeah,
it's a vicious cycle.
Of course, you never want to incentivize people destroying their bodies and destroying their lives ultimately, but it seems like some cities are hell-bent on doing that. Before I get to the Bureau, just a shout out to our friends in the live chat. Dawn Marie's here, Jake Rixner, Darren DeFries, Joe Maliga, Mark W. Appreciate you stopping by. Christopher Musto is watching through LinkedIn. Steve Iarato, Winston, of course, he's tuning in as well. Appreciate all you guys being here. And Montante is watching. Mike Montante, that is, on Twitter. I appreciate you being here, Mike, as well. So 1997, you're having a ball on the local side. You're in a pretty sweet spot on the local side. But the FBI is the FBI. It's an iconic agency. Now, you had taken some classes, or at least were aware of some classes that the FBI offered during your time as a police officer, later detective and sergeant. So tell me about that decision to go from a pretty sweet gig on the local side to the Bureau.
I had a great gig on the local side, and was thoroughly enjoying every day of my job, which I think actually made the transition easier for me in a strange way, right? So it all started. My friend Steve Garn, who I mentioned earlier, was working with a federal task force, and they were working a motorcycle gang that was operating in the area. Cliff Hedges, FBI agent at the time, he's now retired, was the lead agent on it. And I didn't have a lot of contact with the FBI. They were in Springfield, but they were mostly working the Springfield area and occasionally come out to our communities, but not a lot of contact. And honestly, I never really thought about going to the FBI. I proudly say it took me 9 years to get a 4-year degree. Right, I worked midnights during all of those years, and went to school during the day, went to court and missed school, and I wasn't the there were no awards given to me in college for my prowess in the classroom. But so Steve started was working this case with the FBI, and it was a motorcycle gang, the Diablos motorcycle gang, and they set up a takedown ended up being in Northampton at the Northampton airport, where they flew in drugs and set up these motorcycle gang members with undercovers and an informant, and they delivered a bunch of cocaine. We took these guys down. The FBI SWAT teams were there. They had their technical surveillance. It was really amazing for me to see all the things that they were doing. And during that case, Cliff Hedges said to me, "Hey, they had a hiring freeze in the mid '90s for the FBI, and he said that the hiring freeze is breaking. You ought to apply to be an FBI agent." I was like, what am I going? How am I going to? I don't even know how to do it. Right at that time, it was literally a piece of paper you had to fill out with pen and ink and send it in. Right, so it was not like no internet, none of that kind of stuff. And so he gave me a photocopy, barely could read the put your name here, all this kind of stuff. So it was a short sheet to fill out. And I came home to my wife, Jean, who later became an FBI agent. I came home and I said, "Hey, what do you think if I put in for this agent position? We may have to move, and we'll definitely have to move, and that kind of thing." And so she immediately said yes. And at that time, my mom had passed away. I went down to my dad and said, "Hey, what do you think if I do this?" And he was very supportive. And I was 30, maybe 32, 33 years old. And he said, I had an opportunity to do something in Chicago. I never did it. And I've always thought, what if, right? So he says, do it. He says, there's only one other thing that I would like you to have done in your life, and that was become the Pope. And that was pretty much out of the pictures. My wife, Jean, shut that down. And so I put in the application, and it took about a year to get the application process going. And interestingly, there's a thing that they do in the FBI where they interview your spouse, right? So it's called a spousal interview, and they want to find out if you're a decent person, what's your family life like, and kind of get your life partner there and say, how is this guy, when he's not working, what's he like, that kind of thing. And so, and they also want your spouse to know that you're going to have to carry a gun. You're going to work a lot of hours and that kind of stuff. And so they start telling Gene, he's going to have to carry a gun if he makes his agent process. He's always carrying a gun anyway. He's a cop, right? And he's going to work a lot of hours. And she's like, there is no way that he's going to work any more hours than he already does. And so they were like, okay. Then they said, Gene, what do you do for a living? And she said, I'm an internal auditor for a bank. And literally my spousal interview stopped. They handed me, at the time it was a VCR, and said, watch this VCR, Tom, this tape on how to do push-ups and pull-ups and all this kind of stuff. And they took Jean out of the room, and she was gone for like a half an hour. I figured, well, this is the way the FBI does it. They separate you, and now they're getting her to tell all these stories about me. And she comes back in the room, and she says, they want me to put in for a job. I'm like, all right, what job? Like a professional support employee? She's like, no, an agent. I'm like, this is about me. I'm the guy going. The next she put in, and she was hired a year after me, and so they had 2 for the price of 1.
Oh my
and
goodness!
Then we went to Quantico, class 97-9, and she was 98-9.
Exactly a year apart. That's amazing. There's a movie, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie were in it, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I believe it's what it's called. That's the real life Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Yeah, that's us. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And you know what? Before I get into the investigations, on one hand, you knew local law enforcement. You'd done it for 14 years. You'd been through the academy. Now here's Quantico. Was Quantico harder for you, or was it easier given your experiences in the previous 14 years?
So the local academies in Massachusetts at the time were run by the state police, and it's a stress academy, and a lot of yelling and screaming and all this kind of stuff, and dropping, give me 25 and run around the building and all this kind of madness, right? So at 20 years old, 21 years old, when I went to the academy, that was great. I loved it, right? It was, and now I'm 30 years old. I'm like, I don't know if I want to go through this again. But the FBI Academy is all about, the structure of it is classes. It's like a college environment with fitness and, running and a lot of shooting. So it is a different type of academy. Each one of those academies have this is really hard. And for me, the academy was, it gave you the ability to sit down and really do studying that I couldn't do when I was in college because I was working midnights. Here I was at Quantico for 4 months or whatever it is. And you're in your dorm room, you're in the library, you're doing your studying, you're on the range every day, you're doing the defensive taxes, you're doing the fitness, all the runs and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed the FBI Academy because you could concentrate on nothing but what you're trying to learn there, right? So I think the FBI Academy was an amazing place, and it was. I remember I wrote a postcard back to my dad from my dorm room, and I'm like, "How cool is this? I'm on the range, and one of the hostage rescue team helicopters takes off and flies right over us." I'm like, That didn't happen back in Western Massachusetts, where a team of agents hanging out of a helicopter flies over you while you're on the range, and it's like a Disneyland for law enforcement. And at the same time, you have what's called the National Academy, which are local officers, ranking officers from departments all around the country and the world that attend the FBI Academy, and you're there with them also. So it's as we say in Massachusetts, it's a wicked cool environment for law enforcement training. There isn't anything that they can't do down there that and all the National Academy graduates come out of there, and it's the best program that the FBI has ever had is bringing local law enforcement there to train and to train with the FBI, because when they leave there, they're on board. I mean, they get not watching the movies and sound bites of what the FBI is. They are now part of that family, and that builds that law enforcement community that is so important in getting the job done around the country. Those connections and that's, and it's the same thing as an FBI agent recruit. You're in there with people from all over the country, and you're all being placed in different parts of the country, and you don't really know until like 6 weeks in where you're going to be assigned, where you're going to be living. And so coming from Massachusetts, I clearly put in Boston for my first office, and then there's 56 field offices. And I think somebody in the Human Resources Division puts a blindfold on and uses a dart and throws it at the board, and they come up, O'Connor, you're going to Washington, D.C. And I think there's probably more to it than that now. But I think back then there wasn't that much more to it than throwing that dart into the wall. And needs of the Bureau, right? Where the Bureau needs people is where you're going to end up going. So myself and a handful of people from my class went to Washington, D.C., and that's where I ended up staying for close to 23 years.
Oh, of course. And people point to the New York field office as being the flagship office, if you will. Don't get me wrong. Nothing against the New York field office, but Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, I'd say that's probably the flagship office of the FBI.
Well, if you're from the Washington field office, WFO, you do say that is the flagship. And I like to bust the chops of my comrades in New York by telling them that. New York field office is also like no other, right? I mean, yeah. It is, and like I'm a Red Sox guy. I'm not a Yankees guy. New York, I never really had any reason to go there. I went there for my initial interview, a 6-person panel interview was to New York City. And I was like, hey, this place is actually pretty cool. And so I give kudos to all the agents around the country, but agents working out in New York City, it's a different animal, right? But it's not all positive. It's not all bad either. I mean, there's a lot of there's cases and stories that you're going to get in your career out of New York that you're not going to get anywhere else. And Washington field office in DC, you're also going to get cases and stories and opportunities that you wouldn't get in a lot of other locations. So, there are a lot of great places to live and work in the United States. Washington, D.C., some people are like, the traffic is awful. The housing market is through the roof and has been for a long, long time. So your commute is a long commute to get into work when you're starting out as a GS-10 entry level agent. So yeah, it's got its positives and negatives, both flagships, New York and Washington, D.C. But I'm glad I landed in Washington, D.C. It gave me opportunities that I would have gotten nowhere else, and really made for what I feel was an interesting career and opportunities that we wouldn't have gotten anywhere else.
And you were thrown into the deep end of the pool right away, because here you are a year into it. And 1998 presents another holy crap, he's on to something moment, where 1993 had turned people on to who Osama bin Laden was and what he meant for America's future and Americans by extension, I should say. Then comes, of course, the attack on the U.S. Air Force Base in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Khobar Towers in 1996. Then he does an interview with John Miller on ABC in 1998, June of 1998 to be exact, is when it aired. 2 months later, the embassy bombings in Nairobi in Kenya, U.S. embassy bombings to be exact. 224 people, including, I believe, a United States Marine, were killed in that attack. And here you are, like I said, a year into your time at the FBI, sent out to Nairobi to investigate. Tell me about that.
So, you're exactly right on your timeline. And so I came in 97, and as we talked, have been working street crimes and local issues. And I land at the Washington field office. I get assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And in 1997, a lot of the direction of the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and there were only a handful of them, New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., was domestic terrorism. It was following Timothy McVeigh and the bombing in the Murrah Federal Building in April of 1995. So we were still following up on that case. The trials were coming up. So we were working a lot of domestic terrorism across the country because that was the threat of the day. Right? There were agents that I remember that knew a lot about the international terrorism stuff, and that wasn't the world that I came from, and I was kind of thrown into the international domestic terrorism world. And there were people who could just rattle off who the players were and that kind of stuff. And I thought, wow, that's just amazing. It's very difficult when you don't come from that arena to even figure out how the naming of subjects goes. What's first name, last name, grandparents' name, all this kind of stuff. And it's that in of itself is a skill set, right? When you're not coming from that world, and knowing the workings of why people are angry with the United States or with the West, this type of thing. And you're 100% right. It was that fatwa called by bin Laden that was the writing on the wall, right? In August of 1998, the August 7th, the bombs went off in Nairobi in Tanzania. And I had just gotten on to the evidence response team at Washington field office, which is an extra duty where you get specialized training in evidence recovery, forensic recovery, fingerprints, DNA recovery, all these kinds of things. And I was lucky enough to get onto that team because of my career in law enforcement before. There was a canvas that went out, and because I had a detective background and this type of stuff, I was able to get onto the team. And the team had deployed to Riyadh and Khobar and these kinds of things. And I was just, amazed that I was going to potentially have the opportunity to go to something like this to work. And it was those embassy bombings. I was actually in the gym in the basement of the Washington field office on a treadmill, and somebody said, "Hey, you're on the evidence team, right?" I said, "Yeah, just got on." And they said, "Well, better get your bags packed. You'll be going to Africa." I'm like, "What for?" And they're like, pointed to the television, and there was the embassy bombing. And it was at that time I kind of realized, hey, I actually may go. I don't know if I'm going to go. And got upstairs to the squad, and that's where we started rolling out to the embassy bombings. And we deployed out of Andrews Air Force Base with our evidence response team, some investigators from the Washington field office, and then investigators from the New York field office, because John O'Neill, who was the SAC over the counterterrorism there, was the guy who had been saying, this guy bin Laden is trouble. And agents like Ali Soufan, who was on their counterterrorism, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, these guys have been kind of saying that bin Laden is he is the next big trouble that we're going to be having, and they were 100% right. And so we went to Nairobi, stayed there for several weeks, sifting through the rubble. And I can remember, again, it's one of those moments in a career where something happens and you realize that trajectory of your career is about to change. And we pulled up in a small white van, our evidence team. We arrived in Nairobi, and when we pulled in, in the van, we got out, and I had never seen anything like this. Right, there was a bank next to the Fundy Day, the school, and then the embassy, and I believe it was 28-story bank building was completely gutted. And there was, people were like 5,000 people were injured in downtown Nairobi. And so everything was destroyed. Just the sheer size of this bombing was just, it took you back, right? I mean, and I looked at that and I said, I don't want to do anything but counterterrorism. If you can potentially get in the front of something like this from happening somewhere in the world, anywhere in the world, then that is going to be just makes everything come together for why you're doing this. And so we worked that scene and put together a lot of really good evidence, tying people that were bombers, tying people who were involved. One of the bombers actually ran away from the scene but was injured, and we went and swabbed for explosive residue and DNA in his hotel room. And I say hotel room in kind of like a shanty hotel room, and put all these pieces together so the investigators, and that's what the evidence team does. They collect the evidence forensically to assure that the investigative teams are getting the very best evidence they potentially could to help them put their case together. And I found that to be one of the most interesting parts of my career, was working the evidence response team. And because we were at Washington field office, our opportunities were just, I mean, almost to the point where it was too much at some points, because we had Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. It changed over the years, but that was our responsibility for any counterterrorism crimes against U.S. interests or U.S. citizens. So you can imagine, as things progressed in the war on terror, it fell to the Washington field office and the New York field office and other field offices to assist repeatedly. And 1998 was the first, and very impactful in my career. And my wife Jean was in the academy at the time, and literally we made it back to the United States after our deployment, and she graduated on September 11th of 1998, and I was able to give her badge at Quantico, and Director Free was there, and I was asked to give Director Free a tour of the embassy at night when he first came in, because I had been working inside the embassy with the evidence teams. And I went down there. And so at Quantico, when I showed up to give Jean her badge at her graduation, Director Free was like, "What are you doing here? Didn't I just see you in Africa?" And so I'm like, "Yeah, man, I came back just to do this," right? So we're both here. So he stayed the FBI director, and I stayed an FBI agent for my entire career.
And just before we go any further in this timeline, let's trace the timeline back even further to where I mentioned earlier. We go to the bombing of Khobar Towers in 1996. October of 1993, bin Laden's believed to have shot down U.S. helicopters in Somalia, killing 18 soldiers. There's the bombing of the Trade Center in 93. And there's also the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1990. And 10 years later, 2 years after the embassy, 10 years after the Kahane assassination, the USS Cole, October 2017, sailors are killed in that particular attack, which was a suicide bombing. Now, here you are again. It's the same individual again. You cross paths with John O'Neill again. I believe you cross paths with Lenny Hatton here, too, who we'll talk about momentarily. So with the Cole bombing here in Yemen now, after 2 years, after the previous 2 years attack occurred in Africa, tell me about that investigation.
So, the 98 bombing, and then every year had some kind of deployment, right? 1999, we went to Kosovo on two deployments to do human remains recovery in an effort to determine cause and manner of death. So we recovered over 200 human remains and determined that the cause and manner of death was homicide. And it harkened back to what's going on now in the Ukraine, same type of environment. And then we go 1999 passes with our 2 deployments to Kosovo. We get to, and that becomes important for a reason that I mentioned that, right? So we get to the USS Cole. We land in Aden, Yemen, and strange, we landed there, and our C-130 is sitting on the runway, and the Yemeni authorities kind of encircled us and didn't let us off the plane. They weren't sure what they were going to do with us, and interestingly, at the Aden airport, there was a billboard that said Bin Laden Construction, because Bin Laden's father was the head of, owned a lot of things, and one of them was a construction company. So we all kind of shook our heads when we ended up getting out of the airport. We brought about 5,000 pounds or more of equipment to process the Cole bombing. And when I got up onto the squad that morning, they said, "Hey, there's been a U.S. Destroyer attacked in the harbor in Aden, Yemen." And I honestly thought this was like a red team drill, that they're going to start like, what would you do? Okay, I would put a team together, this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, it was real. We put a team together, 8 evidence response team people. There was elements of the hostage rescue team that went for a security element. There were investigators from Washington field office and New York that went to process the USS Cole. There were other teams that were brought in and ended up in Germany doing work at the hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, and then did come into Yemen for a short period of time. But in working with the Navy, when we first got there, we were told that there were 12 sailors that were still trapped inside the wreckage of the ship. And so myself, John Adams, Kevin Finnerty, and Garrett McKenzie, we had all done these trips to Kosovo and had done a large amount of body recovery. So instead of having the Navy recover their own friends and sailors, and also because the evidence of the sailors being recovered was chemical residue testing, all this stuff, identifying the sailors, this stuff was something that the FBI should be doing. And so we went to Captain Lippold, the captain of the USS Cole, at the time of the bombing, and said, we have all the gear, we have the experience, and we'll do the remains recovery of those 12 sailors. So for the next 2 weeks, our small team, John, Garrett, Kevin, and myself, worked in the galley area inside the belly of the ship, doing just that, recovering the 12 sailors. And I won't go into the graphics of it, but it took us 2 weeks to do. And the inside this galley area, it was we tried to measure the heat in it. The digital thermometer broke at 130. So it was probably, in all of my career, probably the worst environment that we had to do this type of work. And I think the worst part about that was that these were U.S. sailors, and we knew that their families were at home, not knowing what has happened. Had they been killed in action? Did they go to get brought into the hospital and just not get recorded? So it was important for us to recover these sailors as quickly and in the most respect that we possibly could. And we did that. And we recovered all 12 of the sailors. Working with Captain Lippold, we were able to do tentative identifications so that the families could be notified of their loved one and give them some closure, or start that closure that their loved one had been killed in action. We also did searches outside of the galley area and outside of doing the recoveries, but the small boat that came alongside and detonated, we were able to recover parts of that ship. One of the Navy chief petty officers actually found a piece of bone that tied back DNA-wise to the bomber. And we know that from one of the homes that we searched on the shore. where they were actually putting the bomb together and living. We were able to collect DNA there, and it matched the DNA that was found on the ship itself. So, a lot of really good forensic evidence that came back from the USS Cole, from the vehicle that they drove to the shoreline, the trailer that they brought the boat down. All of this stuff was searched, and forensic evidence was recovered from all those things, and then given to the investigators and the lab to do amazing work with, to tie all of those forensic links, whether it be, we actually found on board the ship, we started finding little tiny red fibers. And if you've been on a Navy destroyer, there's no need for a red fiber, multiple on the upper decks of the ship. And so we didn't know what they were. We collected them because we didn't know what they were, but we knew they didn't belong there. And it turned out that it was parts of a rug that the terrorists had put over the explosives on the small boat to cover it when they went out to do their attack. And when it exploded, it threw many of these little red fibers. We also found them in the house where the bomb was built, and these forensically linked through DNA, through class evidence of the fibers, these locations. So this really was very helpful to putting that case together. As part of that, I've been to Gitmo to testify on the evidence portions of the al-Nashiri case, that he is the remaining terrorist who is being held at Gitmo that is responsible for the USS Cole. And several of us have been down there. Mark Whitworth from the explosive lab, and these names are come up in my cases over and over, because there's a small team at the explosive unit that we worked with over the years that are just unbelievable, and there's nobody better in the world for putting explosions together than these people down at the FBI lab. And we always said that the evidence response teams, their important role is to get that evidence to the lab in a usable format, right? So if you collect DNA samples, but they don't make it to the lab because they degraded by the time they got there in heat and all this stuff, packaged incorrectly, then you have nothing. And so working hand in hand, those evidence response teams and the FBI lab, the metallurgy, the explosives unit, all these hairs and fibers, all these units work together to put these cases together. That is really what I thought was one of the coolest things to see was that type of work.
Of course. And something like you said, it's about the closure too, after a tragedy like this has occurred. Because I was thinking, and this is a significantly lesser case compared to a terrorist attack, but one of the reasons why O.J. Simpson was probably able to get off scot-free for the murders of his wife and Ron Goldman was because, as people know by now, that crime scene in terms of evidence was botched and mishandled horrifically. And as a result, key evidence was being kicked around. It wasn't preserved properly. And that led to his acquittal, when many people think, and many people will certainly tell you, they believe he was the one that committed the homicides that night. It's all the more so important when a terrorist attack of this barbaric nature occurs to make sure that evidence is preserved properly. Because like you said, if you can't get it back there in proper form, not only have you let your team down, you let these families down too. Before you respond to that, one of your old colleagues is in the chat tonight. We'll highlight his comment here. Jeff Miller says, Tom did a great job leading the team. First time ever an FBI team will be recovering evidence from a U.S. Navy ship.
Jeff Miller is one of a kind. He is a guy, an agent that we worked with on the USS Cole. He was down there helping us in the galley. And Jeff Miller was someone who we always said would always take that unbeaten path, right, and find stuff down there. And Jeff, I've got great photographs from the ship that were evidence photographs taken, but you can always see Jeff in that photograph doing something, right, running buckets of evidence down to the sifting area. And you never want to say that you when you work with a team, right, you have this team put together. It really is that band of brothers and sisters that you bond with. And even in the worst of situations, you that bonding that you get when you're doing this type of work, whether it be Kosovo recoveries, the embassy bombings recoveries, the Cole bombing. I mean, you become extremely close with the people you work with. And Jeff Miller is one of those guys that repeatedly stepped up to the plate and said, "I'll go." And his sidekick, Kevin Finnerty, they were both cops in Pittsburgh. And you know, I don't want to degrade anybody else's role in where they did before, but I think some of the best agents are former cops, because you're not brand new at it. And my wife was married to a cop, so I guess she was a cop herself and was an investigator as an auditor. But I'm glad Jeff is here tonight. That's awesome.
It's good to see you, Jeff. Thanks for tuning in. And of course, 11 months later, you know, and these attacks are large in and of themselves, but the previous attacks get dwarfed by what we saw in 9/11. Now, in talking with my FDNY and NYPD friends, the scene at the World Trade Center that day and the days and weeks and months afterwards has been well documented. But a lot of people have heard of certainly of what occurred at the Pentagon that day. But this is, I think, the first time I have someone on the show that was there, not only that day, but in the days, weeks, and months afterwards, after Flight 77 struck it. Tell me about that day in Washington from your perspective, where you know what's going on in New York. You're deeply concerned for your colleagues there, and one would be lost, and that was Lenny. And now you have this tragedy hitting right behind you in Washington, at a place that's arguably, outside of the White House, the most fortified place in Washington.
Yeah, so you're 100% right. The morning of 9/11, we were gathered on the squad of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and we watched the news after the first plane struck, and we were all watching when the second plane struck the towers. And it was Chris Combs, who was one of our team members, was at a training with, I believe it was a DC Fire Department, or Arlington Fire Department, and he called back to the office and said, "Hey, we're getting reports of smoke coming from the Pentagon." And I'm here to tell you, the Pentagon is not like the Vatican when they name a new pope and smoke goes up. There's no reason for large billowing smoke to come out of the Pentagon. And so all of us were kind of standing around the squad, we're putting out in those days, we were putting out pages to team members that everybody go home, get your gear. We were likely going to be deploying up to New York to assist the teams up there. And so at that point, there was an agent, Scott Stanley, who was on the squad with me. And Scott was a former firefighter, and his PhD is just like that 1,000-pound brain, which comes into play a little bit later also. But Scott and I decided, hey, the place we don't want to be is inside this building, going to get sucked up into some type of, important, but, go do this, go do that. So we kind of said to the boss, we're going to run down there and check it out. We may have said that. We may have just gone to my car and got into it and left the building at Washington Field Office at 601 4th Street and started over the Southwest Expressway, or Southeast Expressway. And we noticed there was no traffic coming over the bridge into DC. Traffic was backed up. So I had a coffee in my hand, which is pretty common. And I'm driving my Crown Vic, which I was pretty adept to driving, and going up the breakdown lane to get to the Pentagon. It literally is across the bridge. It's 2 miles from our field office. And so as we're going, you could just see the entire sky was black from the smoke coming from the Pentagon. And as I'm driving, Scott's going, "You're not going to make it. You're not going to make it." I'm like, "I'm going to make it." And we made it through there. And the bizarre stuff just started happening. Like, our squad motto was "Non fingus hoc excrementum." And in Latin, that stands for "You can't make this up." And so as we're coming across the bridge, our radio's going with, something's happening, this type of stuff. And we were some of the first agents to get over there. And as we started to exit, I honestly got off the wrong exit, which put us to the lower side of the Pentagon, over by the waterfront side. And as we started to get off that exit, there was a naval officer standing at the top of the ramp stopping cars. Now, we had blue lights and stuff, so he was waving us through. And as I drove by, I stopped and I'm like, looked up at him. It was Kirk Lippold, the captain of the USS Cole, standing on the top of the 395 exit, stopping cars from going down there. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And please let me know where you're going to get assigned next, because I want to know where you're going next. So we end up getting off the ramp and down the lower side of the Pentagon. And I've described it many times as like watching a Godzilla movie. People were just like in mass walking orderly, because they're the military, right? They're walking orderly. They've been evacuated from the building and they're just leaving and walking towards us. And like walking, we were driving into this sea of people leaving the building. And as we're going through the Pentagon Force Protection, one of the officers stopped us and said, you know, who are you? Where are you going? And we told him we're with the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. And he's like, can you take the chairman of the Joint Chiefs out of the building? And I said, yeah, of course we can. So I literally went to my back seat, took all the gear I had back there and threw it in my trunk. And we drove down forward to the big wooden door on the water side. And at that point, a colonel came out and said, they're gone, right? They had already been moved to another location. So at that point, we drove up and over the lawn and made it to the side of the Pentagon where Flight 77 hit. And at that point, we started trying to figure out what was going on and what role the FBI was going to be taking this. We knew it was going to be the evidence recovery portion of the investigation of the terrorist attack. So we needed to try and set up some type of a command post at the back of my car or wherever it ended up being as other agents started showing up. And one of the agents that showed up very early, because we're only like maybe 15 minutes after the plane hit, we were on site, and one of the agents was Brian Botig, and I for some reason had a pair. I didn't normally wear a suit every day, but I had a sport jacket and dress pants and dress shoes on. So when Brian got there, I said, hey, you don't have a pair of 511 pants and a pair of shoes, like boots, so you can actually get to work here? And he's like, I do. So literally in the parking lot outside this burning building, I stripped down and changed my pants. So my storyline always is that there are people who give you the shirt off their back. Brian Botig gave me the pants out of his trunk. So at that point, we kind of got together with military and firefighters leadership and tried to start setting up what we were going to do. And we called back to the field office, and I remember telling them, bring everything that we have for the evidence response teams, because we're going to be here for a long time. And we were there for about a month, just short of a month. We worked with the urban search and rescue teams. We had evidence teams from Baltimore, Charlotte, Norfolk that came in and backfilled us and our team that was working there. And that's a picture of Jean and myself. That's my wife and myself down at the Pentagon. And you know, the interesting thing in that picture there is it's snapped by one of our photographers as we're leaving the building. She's got personal remains in a bag that she's got there. So this was just this event was just horrendous as New York and Shanksville were. We worked with these teams in there and with the military to recover the 224 victims from the plane and from the excuse me, I got the number on there, but from the plane and from inside the building. And it was very difficult work. We had teams that worked in rotation. So teams would go in, stay in there for about a half an hour doing their recoveries, come back out, get a rest, then go back in because of the stress and the believe it or not, it was very hot inside the building because everything had been blown up inside the first, second floors and some above. We sifted through every piece of debris inside that damaged area. And in just an example, one night, and I was a team leader on the night shift, so I coordinated the evidence and body recovery on the night shift at the Pentagon. Doug Edmondson was my partner in that on the night shift. John Adams worked the day shift as the supervisor or the evidence response team coordinator. And John and I had worked on the USS Cole, and Doug and I had worked at the embassy bombing. So those experiences made it for us to be able to figure out a process and do these recoveries, work with the military to recover the remains. We did the recovery, the documentation, and then the military would carry the remains out to a temporary morgue we had set up on the Pentagon campus. And then the evidence that we recovered in one night, we took 72 dump trucks of debris out. It went to a north lot where we spread it out, and teams sifted through all of that debris. It was a lot of work, and it was, if you talk to any of the agents that responded to any of the 9/11 sites, it is something that they would do over again, even though FDNY, NYPD, and the FBI have lost many of our evidence response team people to 9/11 cancers. Unfortunately, the Pentagon, for the FBI, we've lost more people from our team at the Pentagon to 9/11 cancers than we did out of New York or Shanksville. We're at, I believe it's 25 that are documented as having passed from 9/11 illnesses. And in my role as the vice president and president of the FBI Agents Association, we worked very, very hard to recognize these agents and professional support employees who were exposed at all three of these locations, recognize them for line of duty deaths, and then get them assistance, and everyone who responded assistance through the World Trade Center health programs, and the families covered for the Victims Compensation Fund. We work, the FBI Agents Association has been the main driver of this for the FBI and in general federal law enforcement. We work very closely with a former NYPD detective who became an attorney. I saw your during the opening. Matt McCauley is the 9/11 attorney that the FBI Agents Association has relied upon, and he has helped out literally hundreds of FBI agents in registering for the programs, and then on those unfortunate times when people become ill. And currently, the FBI has approximately 300 people who have some form of 9/11 certified illnesses. So much like the NYPD, FDNY, and many other organizations, civilian and sworn, the 9/11 illnesses and the day of 9/11 it has not stopped for many of us that responded to these events, whether it be psychologically or physically. We constantly get calls from people that are now having some form of illness. And the most important thing we can do, and I would say in my 37 years in law enforcement, the most important thing that I've been involved in is recognizing these agents, professional support employees, and then when tragedy strikes, through the FBI Agents Association charities, which I'm still working as the charities ambassador for the Agents Association, raising funds to assist the families with college education for those who have fallen, their children, and the Membership Assistance Fund for those who are sick, for families in need, for not just 9/11, but for many things. I think the 9/11, pushing those programs with Matt McCauley, John Thiel, John Stewart up at the Capitol was probably the being involved in that is one of the highlights of my career, in that you get into this business because you want to help people, and if you can help the people that you stand side by side, the people who are that band of brothers and sisters in their time of need. If you can step forward and actually help to make a difference, then I think your purpose for being in this career is fulfilled. And my wife Jean and I have tried very, very hard to fill those shoes, and with the help of people like Scott Stanley and Jen Hill and Matt McCauley, we have made a difference. I really feel we've made a difference in that 9/11 responder community, so that people and their families are taken care of after this horrendous event. So.
Mm-hmm. And I thank you for elaborating in such detail about your experience in Washington, because, like I said before, the story of the Trade Center has been documented on the show, and it'll continue to be the case in this program. But it's important to recognize that aspect of terrorist attack as well. Steve, I do see your question. I'm going to get to in a moment, but I mentioned Lenny Hatton. You got to cross paths with him on a couple of occasions, and it's important to know that day Lenny was going into work at the New York field office. He hadn't gotten there yet. He noticed what was happening. Lenny was a volunteer fireman in Ridgelong Park, New Jersey, where he was residing with his family. So he had that experience under his belt too. He went there acting in the line of duty and immediately began assisting the New York City Fire Department with evacuations. If you ever watch the French brothers, the Naudet brothers 9/11 documentary, you see him in the lobby. He's wearing a white shirt, has a goatee. He's on the radio. And there's radio transmissions in which he is saying that he's assisting the fire department. I believe he was in the South Tower, and after the South Tower's collapse, no one heard from him. And unfortunately, the reason was he was killed in that particular collapse. When you look back on Lenny from your short time with him on those investigations, what do you remember about him the most?
I mean, Lenny Hatton, like you said, he was a bomb tech working the cases like the Cole bombing and the Africa bombings, and we did cross paths, right? And Lenny Hatton was one of those guys that you just described, right? I mean, you're driving into work, it's very easy when you see all this going on, hear it going on, maybe not drive right to the scene. He chose to go to the scene because that's where he was needed. And that is the epitome of the Lenny Hattons of the FBI and law enforcement across the board. That's why people become police officers, FBI agents, because they want to help. They want to do exactly what Lenny Hatton did, was put his service ahead of himself, right? And I know Lenny's family. The FBI Agents Association has worked with the family. We have honored the family at our annual G-Man Honors Dinner. They're great people. And you know that Lenny would not have done anything to get in the way of his family, but that service is such an overriding commitment when you're in this business that he did what I know a lot of FBI and NYPD and FDNY people did that day, was put themselves in harm's way in an effort to try and help people to get out of that building, those buildings. And I know that if Lenny Hatton was here today, he would say, just like every single person that I know that has been sick, that has passed, that I've talked to, all of them, that they say, I wouldn't have done anything differently, because this is what we're here for. This is what we do. And, you definitely don't want to have something bad happen to you. But, Lenny Hatton did what he did because he believed in the mission and wanted to help people and got into this job for the right reason.
Of course. He went out like a lion. And for those of you that want to read more about Lenny, the FBI does have a page up for him. And also the National Bomb Technicians Memorial has a page up for him too. He was one of 2 bomb technicians killed that day. It was him and Detective Claude Richards of the NYPD bomb squad that made the ultimate sacrifice. Now, moving ahead, before I move ahead, Steve's question, let's highlight that. He says, was collecting all this evidence in the way it was done to find anyone associated with the Cole bombing and bring them to a court trial, like after the Trade Center bombing of 1993, as we saw with Ramzi Youssef and his cohorts, or was it to treat them like terrorists instead of just criminals?
Well, so it was obviously, and it's a great question, because there was obviously discussion on whether these terrorists should be brought back to New York City to be tried, because that was the office of origin. It was determined because New York was the Bin Laden squad. and it was determined that they were going to go to Gitmo once the after 9/11 terrorists were brought there. So people who were arrested for the Cole bombing were rolled up and into that process of the military tribunals. Whether that's something that is right or if it's wrong, I mean, al-Nashiri's been in Gitmo for many, many years, but he hasn't gone to trial yet. I think he would have gone to trial if it was in New York City or in Washington, D.C. The Justice Department would have brought that person to trial. But that's way above my pay grade. I know that we've presented the evidence. We were the first people from the FBI's Washington Field Office Evidence Response Team to testify at Gitmo related to evidence related to the USS Cole or any of the terrorists being held there. So we went down there and did exactly that, present the evidence that we collected in the Nashiri hearings to forward that case. And it's still languishing in Gitmo, and they haven't brought it to trial yet. And there's a lot of discussion that we could have about the process. I know that the FBI teams that responded to the USS Cole did their extreme best in recovering the evidence. The FBI labs worked an amazing amount of hours in processing that evidence. And when the ship was towed back to Pascagoula, it was processed a second time there by teams. And actually, the debris from beneath the USS Cole in Aden Harbor was recovered and brought out onto a barge and sifted through in that process. So literally, there was no expense spared in trying to make an effort to recover all of the possible evidence to forward a criminal case on the actors who were involved in the USS Cole bombing.
It was a well-done effort from top to bottom. Now, a couple more questions, and this is something that's worth noting as well, is that bin Laden did not stop after 9/11. We saw that in Madrid in 2004, saw it again in London in 2005, but because of the work at the JTTF, we haven't seen such a large-scale attack play out here since September 11th, 2001. So as far as the preventative measures, I mean, of course, don't go into anything that's classified. We don't want that. But as far as surface level preventative measures, and also keeping tabs with your counterparts in these countries that have been affected, as Madrid was, Spain we're talking about, of course, in 2004, and England in 2005. Tell me about that dual-pronged process.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces after 9/11 were beefed up. They were expanded. There were Joint Terrorism Task Forces opened up in field offices that didn't have them. There were satellite Joint Terrorism Task Forces that were opened up in smaller offices connected to larger offices. So the mesh of the Joint Terrorism Task Force was really, the net was spread wide across the United States. And when you talk about the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, you're not just talking about the FBI. Okay, so our task force in Washington, D.C. had well over 40 different agencies on it, from the local police departments in D.C., Fairfax County, Prince George's County, the ATF, DEA, all of these, every agency that had some role in counterterrorism sat on our task force. And same goes across the board to the other task forces across the country. And the important part of that is that as an FBI agent in Washington, D.C., I'm not from Washington, D.C. I don't know. After 22 years, I was pretty well versed with it. But when we first got there as a new agent, you didn't know your way around the city. So you had to really work so closely with your local state and other federal partners on a daily basis. And the beauty of the JTTF has been and will continue to be that as an FBI agent sitting on the squad, if I had a question that involved Fairfax County, I would in around 2001, I'd have to call to Fairfax County detectives and try and get to talk to somebody and find somebody who, kind of shop around to find will talk to you, wants to talk to you, knows what you're asking about. I just went across not even across the hall, like across the desk to Dick Line, the detective from Fairfax County, who I had coffee with, I had beers with, we knew each other, and there was that bond throughout the Joint Terrorism Task Forces that you were a team. And if there was a threat in a community, then that was our threat, right, across the board. And all of those resources, all of the FBI's resources, all of the local, state, and federal resources came together to work those threats. Following 9/11, the number of threats that were coming in, the tips, and it was unbelievable, the amount of information coming in, that much of it was kind of, worked out to it wasn't anything there. Some of it worked out to be there is something there. And there were a lot of cases that were done across the country where you will never hear about, but they protected this nation. And many of them you will hear about. People were arrested for possession of explosive material, whatever it happens to be. So these task forces are and will be the backbone of counterterrorism work, and that includes working with our overseas partners. Who there's schools around the world, but in Garmisch, Germany, there's a place called the George C. Marshall Center, and it's in a beautiful part of Germany. And Gene and I have been going to the Marshall Center for over 11 years, training with our foreign partners. And so these schools include about 90 students from about 40 different countries: Middle East, Africa, Eastern Europe, and they all come together for a school called the Program of Terrorism and Security Studies. It was a 5-week school, now it's about a month, and you have speakers from all over the world coming in and talking about their work in counterterrorism. Gene and I go over and talk about the evidence response team work in recovering evidence in counterterrorism environments. I do a class there on domestic violent extremists. So, we've talked a lot about my role as a evidence response team leader. My primary investigative mission in the FBI for 22 years was domestic violent extremism. I worked white supremacists, anti-Semitic violence, long before where we are today, right?
Yeah,
So,
I was going to say it's becoming a growing problem, not to cut you off, but as you were saying that, look at what just happened in Lewiston.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that this is not going to get better before it gets worse, right? And it's already very bad, and things repeat themselves, and the FBI has a very difficult mission, and it's worked through the Joint Terrorism Task Forces that they have to keep an eye on the domestic violent extremists and the international violent extremists and groups and terrorist activity around the globe. And that is a massive undertaking. And it's done through working in the intelligence community, working with our partners around the world and domestically here to expand that footprint of the FBI and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. We have always said that the FBI is never going to do counterterrorism work by themselves. It is a task force, a joint terrorism task force concept that is the only way to get this job done. It is the pedal on the gas has not been let up. It certainly is. We have the threat streams from both sides of this terrorist coin are in full mode right now. So dangerous time.
Absolutely. I mean, back then you had a lone wolf like a Tim McVeigh, but lone wolves were few and far in between. Now, like you said, you hit the nail on the head with that Quinn analogy, and it's a very good one. You have the dual threat, which makes for scary times, of that lone wolf who may not be a direct associate or member of these organizations, but is inspired by the ideology. And then you have these organizations with the money they have in their possession and the weapons to carry out these attacks that has the FBI very, very busy, and other agencies too.
And you have to add to that our foreign adversaries that are sitting back and using social media and other platforms to influence the population in the United States through that social media interaction. And by doing so, they can really manipulate how people in the United States think. And they are purposefully dividing our population. And I think they've done, unfortunately, a very good job of it. And that adds to it. So what we are seeing today could not really have happened in the early 90s, although there were the rise in right-wing extremism in the 90s leading up to McVeigh's bombing. But that was all done through handing out flyers and telephones and in person. Now a person can sit down in their mother's basement typing out stuff and send it out to literally millions of people. If you look at concepts and conspiracy theories such as QAnon, that reached millions of people. And that was, and I've talked about this for years now, QAnon is nothing but a anti-Semitic rebrand of the ideas of that Adolf Hitler used to vilify the Jews. Now QAnon is using that to vilify the liberal elite, which also transcribes to the Jewish elite. It is the same, the book of protocols. It's exactly the same message that's being put out. And unfortunately, many people are buying it. And that is it has and it will send us down a very difficult road and rabbit hole for us to get out of. And scary times.
On a more lighthearted note, there was something going around. To your point, I'm scrolling through Twitter, and I have Twitter to keep up with the news, keep up with sports and whatnot. And somebody retweeted something, I think, just out of the sheer humor of it, because it was so stupid. JFK Jr. is coming back. That was one of the theories that was floating out around.
That's
QAnon.
But you had hundreds of people show up in Dallas, Texas, waiting for JFK and JFK Jr. because JFK Jr. JFK was the last legitimate president elected in the United States, if you believe QAnon and the followers. From JFK forward, so JFK shows back up, JFK Jr. shows back up in Dallas, and then they will name the next president. If you're following QAnon, you'll know who that is. So. I say it over and over, non fingus hoc excrementum, but unfortunately, this is where the violence is coming from these conspiracies, these false narratives that are being portrayed. And now you have the war in Israel, you have the war in Ukraine, and all of the manipulation of the narratives coming back from that are just playing into the hands. I frequently say the only person that is laughing about all of this is riding a horse shirtless in Russia. And Putin is the only person, along with a couple of others in other countries, North Korea, Iran, that are using this social media and our inability to actually discern facts any longer, and using it to manipulate us into believing. Hey, Thanksgiving is coming, right? The best way to get out of having to buy any Christmas presents, Hanukkah presents, whatever you celebrate, is to start talking about politics at Thanksgiving. By the time you're done, no one's going to be talking to you. You won't have to buy a present for anybody. It'll be a money-saving thing. That's a little tip from Tom.
I'm laughing at that. Margaret Hearn's comment, who's one of my most loyal viewers, she says, if John F. Kennedy Jr. is coming back, can you give him my number? We'll do, Margaret. We'll get on that for you.
Guy.
Yeah, he was, and he lived in Manhattan for many years. George Magazine, he ran in the 90s too, before his untimely death in the summer of 99. And to your point, before I ask you about your retirement in 2019, I grew up watching wrestling, right? And so you'd see these big returns. Wrestler takes some time off or recover from an injury, but we don't know that as 8-year-olds. Oh my God, it's the Undertaker, he's back. And it's that, but on steroids and playing out in real life, to where it's literally the theater of the absurd. literally the theater of the absurd. Now, I move ahead to 2019, and there's some people, right? You bring up a good point of all the things you've done across the years that I'm going to use an analogy of my own. It's like eating a really good meal. You can't eat anymore. You're filled up to the brim, but you're satisfied because you ate so good. And that's kind of how I view your career in law enforcement, from the local side to the federal side. So in 2019, when you decided to hang it up, was that the mentality? Was it, I've done everything I could possibly do. I think it's time to move on to the next chapter.
Well, I'll tell you what, once again, there is that watershed moment, right? So during my 22 years in the FBI, if something blew up, if there was a mass shooting. Now, we talked a lot about international travel and stuff, but our teams and we responded to mass shootings around the country in Northern Virginia and Virginia. One of the last shootings that I worked crime scene of was the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. We worked a mass shooting in Norfolk. Just many of these type of horrendous events. And whenever this kind of stuff happened, I for probably 21 years of my career, I was always one of the first ones to raise my hand and say, "Hey, let's go." And then once you get decent at something, then you couldn't get out of it, right? It was like, okay, put a team together, you're going, and okay, you can't really say no. I've got something going on, and over the years, you miss a lot of those things going on in your family life, and so I remember it very clearly. There was a bombing in the country of Georgia, and Jean had become she was actually the head of the evidence response team for about 12 years. So she ran the Washington Field Office Forensic Evidence Response Team, and so we did a lot. We went to Iraq 5 times, Afghanistan 3 times. Worked cases over there, counterterrorism cases, and spent a lot of time in places that things were happening. And Jean came to me one day and she's like, "Hey, we just had a bombing in the country of Georgia. Do you want to put a team together and go?" And this is probably around 2000, close to 2018. And I looked at her and I said, "No, I don't want to go. I will. But I don't want to go." And that was really, it hit me that there is, and no one believes it when they're running and gunning and young. And not that I'm old, but that when you're in the middle of it and you're so excited to go do this work and try and do the right thing, that some point you're going to say, I don't want to pack my bags again. And I don't really. I've done it so many times, and I get it. It's important, but it's time for somebody else to do this work, because you can't be a single point of failure as the only people who do this stuff. You have to spread that wealth so that we have depth, right? It's like a baseball team having a great pitcher, and all you ever do is play that guy. You can't do that. You got to have depth. So we made sure that we were training people and bringing people with us to get that experience. And I think we felt very comfortable in 2019. We retired on September 11th of 2019. Both Jean and I did. And we did that for those of our friends that couldn't retire. So it was the perfect time to go out. And honestly, there has not been a time where I said, I wish I didn't retire. I could have stayed another couple of years. I could have put in for extensions. I probably could have stayed another 4 years. I could be just retiring now. But the time was right, and it was right for us. We've done everything together as a team, and it was the right time for us to pull the pin, as they say. And that's what we did. We retired on September 11th of 2019, and we took about 9 months and kind of traveled around in our RV. We had a great time, and then all of a sudden, it's like The Godfather. You were out, and they sucked you back in. The Agents Association asked Jean if she would be the executive director, running the office and all the finances and all the work around that. And she said, "I'll give you 2 years, and it was just short of 3, almost 4 years that she did as executive director. They brought me back on as the charities person, and we've in the past 4 years we've raised probably close to $4 million for the charities of the Agent Association. So we've been back in that mix, and then we opened a small company, Fed Squared Consulting, and still doing training and security work for clients across the United States and with some overseas connections. And so it's as much as we want to do, and it has been very interesting in a different angle. So it was time.
Absolutely. And you left on a high note. And I love what you mentioned there, because I always bring that up with my PD and FD friends that talk about how they missed the job. You got to make that walk to the pension section. And I've said that several times before. The audience has heard it. There's so many people, unfortunately, who have not and will never get to make that walk. So to be able to get to the end there, it's such a dangerous profession. It's a good thing.
It's a positive if you can get to the end of the road with all, as the bomb tech say, with all your fingers and toes. And your brain is just as important in that aspect. And at some point, we always used to tell the teams, at some point doing this type of work, working these major crime scenes and stuff, you got to realize that enough is enough. And if you want to be sound when in your retirement, then maybe you ought to make the call when you make the call. And I think there are some people on this podcast that are watching, Jeff Miller being one, who may argue that I may have not been sound for quite some time, but I think it was time to do it, and it worked out just right.
I'll say. Well, this has been a heck of a show, my friend, but we got to end as we always end, and that's with the rapid fire. It's 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want, and we'll go right into it with the first one. From your days as a police officer, 2-part question. Funniest call you ever responded to? Most uplifting call you ever responded to? First, funniest.
I mean, let me tell you what, if you didn't enjoy every single day of your job as a police officer, then you were in the wrong business. I remember one day Andy Trushaw and I got a call for an alarm, and this one just pops into my head. Andy was a pretty wiry guy, so we found a window that was partially open, and so Andy went up the side of the building, and I pushed him in, and he went inside there, came around, unlocked the door. We searched the premises. It was a restaurant, and there was nobody in there. We couldn't find it, but we called the owner and said, "Hey, come on down. Your alarm's gone off, and you have to come down and reset the alarm." And it was like a restaurant bakery kind of thing, right? So it had like a deli cabinet thing with a glass that you can go in and pick what kind of stuff you want, and a freezer below it, kind of thing. And they had really good cookies. So when I talked to the owner, I said, "Hey, we're going to have a couple of cookies and a soda. We'll pay you when you get down here, but we just want you to know that if you walk in here, we are going to be eating a couple of cookies." And he kind of laughed and said, "All right, I'll see you down there." So at that point, we were just kind of standing around waiting for him, and I went around to the back of the cooler, the deli meat section there, and it had those freezer doors on the bottom. And I said to Andy, I'm like, "Hey, Andy, I'll bet the guy's hiding down under here." I kind of laughed, and I opened up the bottom cooler, and there's a foot. And literally, the guy had, when he heard us coming, crawled into the freezer. If we didn't find him, he'd been dead.
Yeah, he would have died.
And so I opened up the door, and the fight was on. We dragged him out through that door, and we dragged him through what we were later told was leak soup. So he had like this soup all over him, and so we thought that was pretty funny that we arrested the bad guy in the leak soup container, and we also saved a life, because if the owner came down and set the alarm, he would have frozen to death in there.
Yep. That would have been the end of him. Hey, then again, Murphy's Law, right? And Murphy, as many Irish people tell me, Murphy is an Irishman after all. And now for the second part of that question, most uplifting call you ever responded to from your police days?
From the police days, I think, I can remember there was a couple whose house was broken into, and they had some very important stuff that was stolen from them. And I was a new detective and kind of put the case together pretty quickly. and determined who was behind it and got all their stuff back for them. And that's not a big case at all, but it was a case where I knew the family. It was one of my first real cases as being a detective, and they were just so happy to get these like family heirlooms back that some drone stole and probably would have thrown them away because you couldn't pawn them. But to them, it meant the world to give it back to them, and it kind of made me feel good about it. So I would say I would put that as in one of the positive check boxes side of the equation.
I'll say, yeah. Second, best advice anyone ever gave you.
Best advice that I lived my 22-and-a-half-year career through: don't do anything unless you want to see it on your hometown newspaper's headline. And if you make a decision while you're out there in the street, and that decision is the next day going to be on not like the Washington Post, but in your hometown newspaper where people you know and love are going to read. If you want to have your name associated with it, then do it. If you don't, then don't. And that decision, which I made over and over in my career, is not one that has to be done in a long thought out manner. It can be done extremely quickly in your decision-making process. But I've lived through that. I've lived by that. My father was a local politician, and he kind of impressed that on me at an early age, is, don't screw up. And if you do screw up, think about what your friends and family are going to think about it. And then if it's not good, don't do it.
Fair enough. Good advice. Third, favorite cop show or cop movie?
Adam 12. Read Malone.
At the beginning.
During one of the election cycles, I was working out in the morning, and instead of watching the news, I watched all of the episodes of Adam 12 again. And it made me want to leave the FBI and go back to Midnights in a Patrol Car. It's the best show ever. If you've not watched the original Adam 12, it is the best law enforcement TV show you're ever going to see. Not the remake.
I haven't seen the remake. I got to check out the original. I've heard about Adam 12 because you're not the first person to mention that. The shows I get all the time from people that went into civil service is Adam 12 and Emergency. Those were the two shows people always saw.
Good. Ringer's Lactate.
Fourth, favorite late night snack?
Graham crackers and peanut butter.
That's a classic. Can't go wrong with that. And fifth and finally, yeah, it's a classic choice for sure. Fifth and finally, given your experiences across 36 years, almost 37, what advice would you give anyone coming on to specifically federal law enforcement now? There's a local aspect. What advice would you give a brand spanking new agent?
A lot more of this, a lot less of this. When you're first coming on, listen, find those people that you can rely on, that you trust, and just kind of be their shadow and watch how they work, watch how they interact with people. Be that Rusty Loose in the detective bureau that taught me how to deal with people, how to talk to people. And it's important to know how to do the paperwork and all this kind of stuff. You need to know the laws clearly, but you need to know how to deal with people. So find somebody that's not doing this all day long, texting each other, and find somebody who's doing this. And with good guys, bad guys, getting information from people, it doesn't have to be rock star information. It can be small pieces of that mosaic that make the change in the case. So find somebody you trust and shadow that person and just soak it all in.
Great advice. Stick around. We'll say goodbyes off the air and check out Tom's company, Fed Squared Consulting, as well. And I linked his LinkedIn in the description of this episode, so you can click on that and you can get more access to his company that way. Before I say goodbye to the audience, Tom, any shout outs to anyone or anything you'd like to give?
I'd just like to say thank you for having me on tonight. And Jeff Miller, it was great to see you pop up on this thing. Jeff was the guy who never brought a camera with him, but when you're taking a picture somewhere where you're deployed and standing by for something, Jeff was always like, hey, take a picture of me doing this. So I hope, Jeff, that in your retirement, you bought a camera.
Shout out to Jeff. Maybe I can get him on the show in the near future. And of course,
There you
shout
go.
out to you for making the time. I appreciate it. Great stories tonight, my friend. Shout out to my producer, Victor, as always, for the great job he did tonight. He had to leave early, but he sends his regards and he thanks you for your time as well. And to everybody who tuned in tonight on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and those who will listen to this later and watch the replay on YouTube, much love to you all. Always appreciate it. Coming up next on the Mike and Raven podcast, he was in the Gulf War and he patrolled Harlem. Wasn't easy either way. And in 1991, got onto the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, where he finished up after 15 years there, 20 years in the NYPD in total. Seth Carr will be here. He's currently a trooper, the New Hampshire State Police. On top of that, still going strong. That's going to be volume 38 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. In the meantime, on behalf of producer Victor and retired FBI Special Agent Tom OConnor, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your night. Be safe, and I'll see you Friday.